Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first pub test of the 2022 election, where normal people get their say, and the normal people are right now on the central coast of New South Wales. Thanks for coming, guys. Prime Minister Scott Morrison is here to take your questions. We'll do that in a couple of minutes' time. But first, let's talk about some of the stuff that's around in the news. Now, for those that are first watching the show, this is an opinion show, okay? So the next 10 minutes might be a little bit rocky for you, but hold on. Here's my opinion, then we get to the questions when it comes to the Prime Minister. Now, hands up, how many people in the room saw Each Way Albo, as we call him on this program, on 60 Minutes last night? Excellent, right, cool. You don't have to clap, but it's okay, right? One or two, all right. Well, now, if you have a look at this screen, this is how they introduced their story last night of Karl Stefanovic. The story, of course, has a bit of each way, and then the Prime Minister in the middle of a target that had been shot at. You know, subtle stuff about who they think is the good guy and the bad guy here. Now, this was more like an advertorial than a profile, which of course is exactly what the Labor leader would like to think is going to be the case going into the election, where, well, they did hard-hitting journalism like this. This is 60 Minutes in 2022 when they're backing in a preferred candidate. Roll the tape.
59 just a couple of days ago, and there is no denying Albo looks $1 million, but it comes at a cost. You can't have your Italian cake and eat it too.
You can only look, you can't touch.
I can't.
No.
Now you're just playing with me.
So go on. What did you wish for?
You know what I wish for, Carl. But if I say it, then it won't come true.
Oh, come on, Albo. Just say it.
It's too important. It's too important.
Oh, hand out the Walkleys now. Well, there was even more of this hard-hitting insight into the next potential Prime Minister of Australia. Have a look at this.
Setting a cracking pace these days.
It's been a carefully crafted makeover. The dramatic weight loss, new specs, new suits. It's all very, well, prime ministerial. You'd almost need glasses to recognise the Albo 2.0.
You look like John Curtin. a wartime Prime Minister.
John Curtin, well, fashion, if you just hold on to it for long enough, it comes back.
John Curtin, he apparently looks like now. This is while being economically both Hawke and Howard and Dutton on defence. This guy is like the Fleetwood Mac greatest hits album, apparently, of candidates. Well, we'll see whether it works or not. But then, of course, there was the very sad moment where, despite the fact that you can clearly see that he walked away from a car crash, he says he almost died.
Opposition leader Anthony Albanese has been taken to hospital by...
The collision in January 2021 spurred on all the changes.
Did you think you were going to die?
Absolutely. It was an extraordinary moment where it was just factual. This is how it ends.
Sounds like it really shaped you.
It made me absolutely determined to make a contribution to the country.
Emotional. But then, of course, despite the fact that they were doing everything they could to polish up the alternative Prime Minister, he actually had to go and meet a voter, and it didn't go well in Tasmania.
What do you think of the election coming up?
I'm right here.
No comment.
People are brutal, aren't they, on the road? What's wrong with Albo?
You're looking good, yeah.
Thank you.
You lost weight, yeah, hasn't it? Yeah.
Huh?
Good on you.
Ah, those pesky normal people when you actually get to meet them. Does that look like the bloke who's leading by 10 points? By the way, it's an opinion show. Those that are currently yelling on Twitter, get over yourselves. Now, also speaking about Each Way Albo, and we call him Each Way Albo, why? Because says one thing on a Monday, says something different on the Wednesday, sees what Twitter, which way he'll decide to go. Perfect example of Each Way Albo-ism is petrol prices. Of course, petrol prices, as we know, highest they had been in the best part of 8 years, which meant it was Albo's turn to complain.
Everything is going up. Petrol was almost $2 a litre before the Ukraine conflict. So it's been high for a considerable period of time. We have petrol that is very high and people are really struggling.
So Each Way, would you cut the petrol taxes?
Well, we're not the government, of course. The government is the government.
Well, we're not the government. Oh, well done, sir. Of course, that's perfect each-wayism. Make everyone really angry about an issue and then promise nothing about whether you're actually going to solve it or not. Is it working politically? Of course. But we don't know what the election's going to be about. And when you see what that choice is going to be, well, I think the result is going to be a little bit different than what the polls may suggest, as they did a couple of years ago. Meantime, I want to also show you this. As I showed you on the show last week, there was an opinion poll nobody told you about in the media, which came from the Turnbull Times, The Guardian. And it showed that the primary vote for the Labor Party in Queensland is down apparently 10 points. Now, I don't believe that that 10 points can evaporate from any political side in such a short period of time, but at the very least, it shows that the government is leading in Queensland. As you know, unless they can win seats in Queensland, they're not going to go anywhere near 76, which means hung Parliament and the Greens. Are we excited about the Greens having more power in the next little while? I would think not. Well, unsurprisingly, this, of course, meant that hardcore politicos in Queensland, well, they have to try desperately to change the subject. So enter the senator from Queensland, who is also the Shadow Emergency Services Minister, who decided to, well, bury the Prime Minister last week, and he did so by standing in front of rubble that had been cleaned up.
The one thing you won't see behind me is anyone from the federal government. There's no army personnel helping with this cleanup. We've seen Scott Morrison go missing before when it came to the bushfires. He can't do it again. Currently, Scott Morrison is MIA.
Blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, that is all about trying to desperately bring people back to where they were a couple of years ago. The polls today suggest that that is starting to happen. But there's a small problem. State governments are the ones actually involved in emergency responses. Everyone in this room knows that, and you do at home as well. So wasn't it interesting that after a week of being told that it was a federal government problem, the boss of the SES in Sydney, well, admitted that they had knocked back the ADF, not once, but twice.
I think it is unfair. I mean, our SES volunteers and all the other agencies that assist us have been putting their lives on the line every day to get out there and help the community. They do a lot of planning before any event. As said, we've got a good emergency management framework that we make decisions ready to enact when we go operational. They do a lot of planning, operational response at the time, because things do change and we do expect water to go in different ways. So we are prepared to plan and escalate as necessary.
And despite the fact that she actually admitted that yesterday, she obviously got a bollocking from somebody inside the New South Wales government, because apparently it never happened. Her statement just 24 hours earlier. Base politics, always the same. But back to our old mate Murray Watt. He decided to put this tweet out, trying to pretend that people in New South Wales are getting more financial support dollar-wise than people in New South Wales. It's not true. And of course, we know that the reason that the national disaster was declared, not in Queensland but in New South Wales, was because, of course, Queen Palaszczuk didn't want that to take place, because, of course, her actual role, apart from keeping you safe, is to turn around and to make sure that she becomes the local leader of the opposition when it comes to advocacy for the Labor Party. But again, the facts, which you need to hear, are about how many people have actually been helped with federal financial assistance in the past week alone. Have a look at these numbers. They're incredible to see. Well, the actual amount of money, I can tell you, is 191,000 people have been helped in Queensland with federal money, and 393,000 people have been helped in New South Wales. Not quite the talking point that they would ever like you to believe. Meantime, of course, when it comes to Ukraine, things are getting worse on the ground. More people will die by the time we wake up tomorrow morning, which, of course, is a heartbreak. What is particularly scary is that Russia has now asked China for help. It happened in the past 24 hours, and it is as serious as this thing gets. Because, put simply, as the West has been trying to help Ukraine, Russia now wants China's help. Russia and China have a relationship in a document that they signed last year, which is that both would help defend each other's territory. Russia thinks the Ukraine is their territory, and Taiwan, China thinks they own that. Which is why the choice of the election, I return again to Each Way Albo. Because remember, what he said was the main focus of the Australian security relationship with our biggest defender, the United States. Is it China? No. Climate change is what he believes should be front and centre in the relationship between Australia and the United States. And even last week, when he was giving a speech about national security, He mentioned climate change more than China and 3 times more than Russia.
Taking action on climate change. Climate change. Climate emergency. Climate change on climate change. The implications of climate change to combat climate change. Acting on climate change. Action on climate change.
Now, of course, while the climate might be changing, it's particularly changing in this room because we decided of all of the places to go on the Central Coast, let's go to the one room without a fan in it. So I apologise to everyone who is watching us right now and sweating up a storm, but here we go. So a bunch of climate lunatics decided to yet again have a protest at the Spit Bridge, linking the Northern Beaches, or Zaliland as we like to call it, from the rest of Sydney. You saw them doing that today. Thankfully, police arrested them very quickly, but they were still able to punch out this video.
We need to push the emergency stop button. And so I'm sitting in a bloody road until the government commits to protecting its people. The disruption we are causing right now is minuscule in comparison to the disruption of your fridge floating up to the ceiling of your house, which is what has happened to thousands of people across New South Wales.
So there you go. These people, of course, well, if they go before a court, who knows what's ever going to happen, but largely the form is that these people end up getting away with it, like the protester in Queensland, who, of course, was told that they had their heart in the right place when it came to the protesting. So what did Zali Steggall say about this today? Well, she said, of course, that this was dangerous and it shouldn't happen. However, she also said that if you want real action on climate change, vote for her. So put simply, these idiots are now the military wing of the Zali Steggall and fake independent movement. Sure, we don't like when you block the traffic, but we agree with why. So make sure you vote for us. Also, by the way, on some matters to do with energy, Paul Bongiorno, the bloke who used to be the television reporter for Channel 10, well, he, among others, has been one of those who says what's happening in Russia right now, well, it absolutely should lead to more renewables inside the Australian energy system. However, of course, as Bjorn Lomborg wrote in the Oz just a couple of days ago, that Russia's invasion has exploded our renewables myth. And then even Taxpayer TV today reported this, ABC headline, Australia's electricity grid increasingly vulnerable to hackers via solar panels and smart devices. Sounds like a future we should sign up to, right? Oh, yeah, and of course, the local power station not too far from here, well, the costs will be passed on to us, the taxpayers, sooner rather than later. No giant surprise that so other people can feel good while they live in their Point Piper mansions, you all have to pay. Meantime, a couple of other quick things worth mentioning here too, which is in Victoria, big decision today by the government. And geez, these people do not understand business, let alone small business. But they believe that people who are casuals working for a business, that they should get extra money for, among other things like sick and holiday pay. Chris Lucas is a local restaurateur who spoke to our mate Chris Kenny, where Primetime starts with the Kenny Report at 5 o'clock Eastern each and every night. And he says this is a really bad call.
He's forging ahead here in Victoria with this ridiculous policy in the hope that a federal Labor government comes in and makes this a ridiculous policy a national policy.
Oh, yeah, and you know how Jackie Lambie likes yelling and screaming about anything because she's holier than thou? Small problem when it comes to her donations. And good news for everyone, the CEO of Pfizer says you will need a 4th shot to stave off COVID. Roll the tape.
It is necessary a 4th boost right now. The protection that you are getting from the 3rd, it is good enough, actually quite good for hospitalizations and deaths. It's not that good against infections, but doesn't last very long.
So that's just me. Thank you very much for coming. And ladies and gentlemen, for the first pub test of 2022, taking your questions right now here on the Central Coast, Prime Minister Scott Morrison. G'day, how are you, mate?
Good to see you.
Good. Lovely to see you.
Good to see you. It's good to be on the coast.
This is it. Finally out of the bubble. Get some real life. All right. Now, I want to ask you a couple of quick things before everyone else gets their chance. Today you talked about the choice at the election. What is the choice as you see it?
How strong our economy is will determine the country we live in for the next 10 years. So a stronger economy means a stronger future. And so how well you manage the economy is going to determine the choices that Australians have over the next decade. Why does that matter? If you've got a strong economy, you can pay for the pension, you can pay for Defence Forces, you can pay for aged care, you can pay for all of the essentials that Australians rely on, Medicare, all of these things. If you can't manage the economy and manage a budget, you can't do that. Now our government and I, as Treasurer and as Prime Minister, working with Josh Frydenberg, we've ensured that our economy is one of the strongest economies in the world despite the pandemic, despite the natural disasters. Outstrips the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and the list goes on. The alternative is a Labor Party that haven't got that track record. And what we're going to face over the next 10 years, I'd like to tell you that all of these other challenges will go away. They won't. It's going to be a tough next 10 years. It's going to be a tough next 3 years. And you need a government that knows how to keep our economy in good, strong shape. Not just talks about it, one that's actually done it.
Labor says that they've got the same policy on national defence. They say that they'll be economically like Hawke and Howard.
Yeah.
Obviously, you disagree. But what is it about their economic policy or an idea that particularly you think we need to start talking about because it is a fork in the road?
Well, you know, I could say I could surf like Kelly Slater, but that doesn't mean I can. And I can assure you I don't and can't. And Labor can say that they would have the same defence policy as us, but what I know is that when they were in government, they took defence spending down to 1.57% of the size of our economy, the lowest level since before the Second World War. And so just what we know what that means, if we'd kept defence spending as a share of our economy at the same level that we inherited from Labor, there would have been $55 billion less spent in our defence forces over the last 8 years. There would have been $10 billion less spent this year alone. So that's what I call not just a gap, I call that a yawning chasm between the Labor Party and the Liberals and Nationals, I should say Labor and the Greens, who want to basically end defence spending as far as I can tell, and where a Liberal Nationals government will continue. So just because they say it, I'm not pretending to be anyone else. We're still wearing the same glasses. And, sadly, the same suits. And I weigh about the same, and I don't mind a bit of Italian cake either. So I'm happy in my own skin, and I'm not pretending to be anyone else. And when you're Prime Minister, you can't pretend to be anyone else. You've got to know who you are, because if you don't know who you are, then how on earth are other people going to know? And I think that's what the choice is at this election. You know, not everybody agrees with everything, every call I've made over the last 3.5 years. That's the lot of any Prime Minister. But I think Australians know that I've been the one who's stood up for Australia in some of the most significant challenges we've faced, whether it's standing up in our own region for our freedoms here in this part of the world, or standing up to the big tech companies. And Lucy Wicks is here tonight. She's handing down a very important report tomorrow on standing up to those big tech companies on the terrible things that happen to our young people in particular, but women especially as well, on social media. And I want to really congratulate Lucy Wicks for the great job she's done.
And last one before we'll get our first question up. I think Glenn's going to be our first in a second, but my last question before I hand it over to people way more important than me. It's been a crappy couple of years. I know you can't promise that there won't be another pandemic, that there won't be all of the other things that have rocked us. But how do we get back to normal? How do we return to the joint that we all desperately want it to be?
Have you heard that phrase about build back better? Labor's calling it build back stronger. I got a real problem with this because it sounds good, doesn't it? But actually, the philosophy that sits behind it is actually, it really troubles me. It says there was something wrong with Australia before the pandemic. I think Australia has always been an amazing place. But we're a nation that has a business-led economy, that doesn't want government in the centre of your lives, telling you what to do. Frankly, we've had enough of governments telling us what to do for the last couple of years. Time to move on from all of that. But the way you get things back, I think, to where they were is you grow your economy back. Once small business people are back in their businesses and determining their own future, once Australians no longer have to be as dependent on income support, which thankfully they aren't now. We've got unemployment down to 4.2%. It's an amazing statistic. It's going to an unemployment rate with a 3 in front of it. There are 1 million more women in work today than when we first came to government, and we've got Australians in jobs. So, when we've got our businesses back running their businesses and our economy strong, as it's continued to be strong and build up again, then that's what enables us to get back to where we want to get back to. And that's why I'm for business-led growth. I don't see the pandemic as an opportunity to invite government into your lives for the rest of eternity. But our opponents think like that. And I know that is a view of other countries that have a similar way of thinking to the Labor Party. But here, we believe in business-led growth and letting people get back in charge of their lives.
All right, well, let's take some questions here. Glenn, step up to the microphone, and like a double act, we can grab our microphones here. And
you're on the coke tonight, mate.
Yeah, yes, of course. They'll be, keep it nice and simple. All right, Glenn, you got a question for the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, meet Glenn and the people of the Central Coast.
Yeah, good evening, Prime Minister. How are you?
G'day.
Look, thanks very much for coming tonight, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask you a question. I have to admit and put my hand up, I am a Liberal national voter, and my question is in relation to water and dams. Now, I'm from a little country town called Murrurundi, where you probably don't know it, up past Scone, and we've been through, I know what it's like, we've just come out of last year a really bad, probably the worst drought I can remember. Yeah. So I know what it's like to go through a drought with no water, and I know what it's like now to be with more water than we probably need. However, I've been through both. Yeah. But as a boy, when I was going to school, I grew up in the St George and Sutherland Shire in Sydney. Yeah. And of course, Warragamba Dam has been around ever since I can remember. And the problem I've got is that over probably the past 30 years, we've heard from successive governments that we're going to raise the height of Warragamba Dam, and we're going to build new dams, et cetera, in different locations around the state of New South Wales. Here we are now, where it's always been promised, but we don't seem to see any results, and it keeps going through successive governments. My concern is that so I can keep the faith and hopefully in the future, when is this actually going to come to fruition so that we actually see something like a D11 dozer actually in there digging ground, as opposed to waiting and waiting and waiting?
Good on you, Glenn.
Sure. Well, a couple of dams. Scottsdale Dam, irrigation project down in Tasmania, the Dungowan Dam, the Wyangla Dam, the Emu Swamp Dam, the Rookwood Weir up around Rockhampton, all projects going forward. On top of that, there's Hell's Gate, Big Rocks Weir, all projects that we're absolutely keen, $1.9 billion that we as a federal government have put aside to support state governments building those dams. Now, dams are hard to build in this country. I'll tell you why. The environmental regulations that sit around them and the disposition of state governments to build dams. Now, what we've seen happen, particularly terribly in these last couple of weeks, what we saw, and when I became Prime Minister, I was dealing with drought. But at the same time, I was also dealing with floods soon after up in far north Queensland, where almost our entire herd was lost over those devastating floods in northwest Queensland. We're now seeing similar devastating floods, particularly in Lismore, which is a 1 in 500 year flood, which is hard to get your head around. So we are very keen to build these dams because they're as much a part of unlocking our agricultural sector, particularly in those parts of Queensland, which we know can support an agricultural industry that can continue to feed the world and get us to a $100 billion ag industry by 2030. Now, you're asking me specifically about the Warragamba Dam, as I understand it, and raising the dam wall at Warragamba. And on that project, I'd love to see the New South Wales government do that. I really would. And that's an urban water project, and state governments fund urban water projects. And I know people say, oh, well, why is there all this federal state stuff going on? And I'm not here to have a crack at any state government at all. What I am here to say is, we fund the Defence Forces, we fund the pensions, We fund the migration programs. We fund our security intelligence services and the border protection agencies. And we pay for 61% of health costs in this country, which includes hospitals. So the federal government does its share of heavy lifting on doing all of these things. And I think on an urban water project like Warragamba Dam, I think there is a growing chorus within the New South Wales state government about the need for that project. And I think it makes a lot of sense. But if the federal government starts spending on urban water projects, well, the next thing you'll know, we'll be having to pay for police stations.
Thank you, Glenn. Let's get Michelle up, who's got a question, Prime Minister, about an issue that many of us would care about, of course, which is the debt. G'day, Michelle.
Thank you. Good evening. My question is, how are you planning to pay back the debt that's been incurred during the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the debt that we have today, just over about a third of our size of our economy. If you go to the other G7 countries, twice, 3 times that. So even though I know that that is a lot higher than we'd like it to be, when you compare it to countries around the world, it is significantly less. And that means not only have we got more jobs, more growth, we've got less debt and more jabs. And so compared to other advanced economies around the world, Australia is positioned far more strongly. But on how do we pay back the debt? This is how we do it. The same way when we got elected in 2013. What we did is we took a cost curve that looked like that and we pushed it down like that and we grew our economy. We grew our economy, and you want to lift your revenues, any business person will know this. What you have to do is you have to grow. You have to grow your business. And we had to grow our economy. And so our revenue curve lifted. And as time went on, that meant when we went into the pandemic, we had balanced the budget. And it took us 6 years to do it. Now, we didn't go down the slash and burn approach. And the reason we didn't do that is we're already in some pretty stiff headwinds in our economy. And you've got to keep your economy growing. And that's why we incurred that debt. We incurred that debt to ensure that our economy could get through the worst crisis we had seen since the Great Depression. Had we not done that, I can assure you the debt would be way higher than it was, because now nobody would be in work. Our business infrastructure would have completely collapsed, and the devastation, as I described it at the time, would have been realised as we stared into that economic abyss. So we had to invest. But the difference with us, the Labor Party, is that the Labor Party would have spent $81 billion more. They would have kept JobKeeper going for longer. They said that they complain about the debt, but they want to spend more. And that doesn't add up. What do you call it? Albenomics. It doesn't add up. And so what's important is that you've got to take your fiscal settings, how you're running your budget, back to a after-pandemic normal. And that's what we'll be looking to do, and the Treasurer will be saying more about that between now and the budget. But just to know what 81 billion, it sounds like a lot, but I know you hear a lot of numbers. That is almost 3 times what we pay for Medicare every year. That's how much more they would have spent during the pandemic. They know how to start spending, but they never know how to stop. Now, we knew we had to spend in the pandemic to get the economy through. JobKeeper saved the economy. It saved lives. It saved livelihoods. It saved most businesses around the country. But we knew when we had to turn it off. And there are other things we had to turn off. And they're hard fiscal decisions to turn things off. But we know how to make them, because I've done 3 budgets as a Treasurer and 3 budgets as a Prime Minister.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it. Let's get John. John's got a question, Prime Minister, and I think it might be about coal.
Prime Minister, my question to you. Do you support the coal industry? When will your government build new coal-fired power stations so we can get a reliable base load for manufacturing? So we can compete with the rest of the world, because renewable energies are not reliable for base load and are too expensive. Also, you say to keep up with you're going to bring down, or our economy is going to grow, we need base load for our economy to grow.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the short answer to the question is yes. And the short answer to the question is yes when it comes to our fossil fuel industry, and particularly coal, because it will be around for decades to come. We know that's the case. In fact, demand is going to increase between now and 2030 because, particularly in our region, in our part of the world, they are looking to grow their economies. And until they're in a position where they can use technologies like we can in this country, which enables us to harness other forms of power, then they need that to grow their economies, and they're not about to trade off their jobs any more than we are. And our approach to reliable, affordable energy, and we've got a 5-point plan on the economy. First one is lower taxes and less regulation. The second one is about investing in skills and infrastructure, and we've talked about some of those things on the dams. The third one is reliable, affordable energy, data and digital economy, best in the top 10 by 2030, and sovereign manufacturing, Australian manufacturing. But on reliable, affordable energy, there is a lot of renewable power in the system, but you're right. It doesn't work when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And that is why we've funded the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power plant. What you need in today's energy economy is you need to continue to run your coal-fired power stations for as long as you possibly can. And that is our policy. We want them to run as long as they possibly can. And we also, because what that does is it helps the rest of the energy system, particularly renewables, to, when they're not working, you've got something in backup. And the thing about a gas-fired power plant is you can switch it on and you can switch it off. And increasingly, if you are building a new coal-fired plant, and if someone wants to do that, well, they're welcome to. It'll be difficult because of the state government planning powers, which probably never allow them to do it. But nevertheless, if they wish to, fine. If they're commercial and they stack up, good luck. But with a gas-fired power plant, that actually ensures that we can firm up our energy system, and so you get that reliable, affordable energy. Now, what has that meant here on the Central Coast in the Hunter? The other arrangements we put in to support the Tomago aluminium smelter means it's still open, and it's going to still be open. We did the same thing down in Victoria with their aluminium smelter in Portland. And we did that by ensuring that we were guaranteeing the reliable, affordable energy in to support it. That is coal-fired power for as long as you can possibly run it, but it's also other forms like gas and firming powers that work in that system. So it's a mix, and you've got to have them all. But when it comes to coal industry, it's worth $35 billion to us every year in exports. And that's money Australia needs to grow our economy and to ensure that we can pay for the essential services that Australians rely on.
Good on you, John. Thank you. We've got another question here. Claudine, I think it is. Come on up to the microphone. Meet the Prime Minister.
Good evening. How are you? Okay, for effective government, it only functions when it's at its full potential, with excellence, and to work together for all Australians, when there is a multi-partisan approach. We've seen some very volatile members of the National Cabinet behave in such a dysfunctional way and inconsistent and along their aligned party, which has made life really difficult, especially here on the Central Coast. Confusing, disenfranchising for a lot of Australians. And a couple of things I wanted to ask you was, how's the Liberal Party, not just yourself as the leader, but the Liberal Party, who you represent, and people, going to engage with the other parties to start to get functional government happening again? And how are you going to keep that going, regardless of whether or not you return to government? And the other question I wanted to ask you was, whether or not, or how are you going to re-engage the rest of the community who are disenfranchised at the moment?
Well, there's a lot in that question. You mentioned the National Cabinet, and people have there are a lot of knockers of the National Cabinet. I've chaired 67 meetings of the National Cabinet in the last 2 years, and that's getting, what is it? It's all the premiers and chief ministers, all of whom have their own powers and authorities, none of which have changed. John Howard made this point, about a year ago. The powers that they had, no one really understood because they hadn't used them before. It had been 100 years since our last pandemic. So no powers were handed to them. They've always had those powers. And as a Prime Minister, you don't get to change the rules to suit yourself. You've got to work to the rules that are there. You can't all of a sudden come up with a 6-point try because you just would like it to work that way. That's just not how it works. And so you've got to deal with the reality. And so I pulled them all together and got them in a room. Now, you will have heard about the times we've disagreed, but you wouldn't have heard about the times we agreed, which happened every single occasion over those 67 meetings. I'll tell you about the one we had last Friday. Last Friday, we agreed the winter preparedness plan, which was looking at the combination of what will be a flu season together with a COVID season, and how we're dealing that with testing resources and booster shots for the most vulnerable, and also looking to get rid of that close contact rule. Can't wait for that one, which it's time for that to go. And we worked through that plan together and agreed it. The other thing we worked on was getting the cruise industry back in place. And on the 17th of April, which has been our working date now for some time. So we agreed on that. We agreed on our approach to deal with Japanese encephalitis and what is happening in our commercial pig population and also our feral pig population. Now, that mightn't have got too much attention, but we're spending $85 million on that as a federal government, and the states are really critical to that because they do a lot of the monitoring of the pig populations, and we need to know where this has got to. And I'm particularly concerned, and we all are, about the feral pig population, because even here in New South Wales, you'll often find those in a lot of rural areas that are close to Indigenous communities as well. So we're getting the vaccines out. There's another one. While everything else has been going on with the floods and everything else, lumpy skin disease in cattle, which could wipe out half, again, of our Northern Territory live cattle industry. These are the things we deal with as a national cabinet every time we get together. Now, you never hear about it because it isn't about the states and the Commonwealth fighting. Most of the time, we're working together. Yep, we disagree every now and then, but tell me one family in this room that gets together every single night and never has a disagreement. And then there's Christmas. So it happens. And the Federation's a bit like that. We all have to get on the same page, but occasionally it won't work exactly the way you want. But more often than not, we've been able to get Australia through this pandemic as a team with one of the highest vaccination rates. We've saved 40,000 lives, 40,000. And on top of that, yeah, you've all done that. And an economy which has more people in work after the pandemic before it, an economy that's stronger after the pandemic than it was before it. That's what Australian governments working together has achieved on the ground. So that is how I intend to keep going. I changed it from the old rule, which was full of bureaucrats and everybody would sit in the room and they'd all pontificate and do their aggressive press conference before they all came. It was a waste of time. You wanted to see an issue go nowhere, that you would have sent it to COAG. But at the National Cabinet, we can make decisions at leader level and drive those decisions back down into our bureaucracies. And it works far better. And I tell you, every Premier and Chief Minister will tell you the same, who have actually worked under the old system.
64 different Christmas lunches. I can tell you which one of the premiers I think are the crazy auntie and uncle in that conversation. Thank you very much for the question. Got one more from Daniel before we take a quick break and we continue here live with a pub test. Normal people, and we've surveyed the room, 100% normal. People in the room. We've got that up on the Twitter bio. Daniel, what's your question for the Prime Minister?
Very good. I'm good, Daniel. Yep. Well, you'll hear a little bit more about this in the next couple of weeks, but there's already a lot going on this front. Making sure we continue to make things here in Australia is really important. Do you know we've got more people working in manufacturing today in Australia than we've had for many, many years? And certainly more than when we inherited government, we won government back in 2013. There are more people working in manufacturing now than there were back then. 1 in 8 manufacturing jobs were lost under the Labor Party when they were last in government. Now, our modern manufacturing initiative, which we put in place in the middle of the pandemic, what that does is supports manufacturing enterprises to innovate, to get scale, to invest in new plant and equipment, to get access to markets. And it's in 6 key areas that we're focusing on. Food and beverage is one of those. And I was at a local business with Dr. Michael Fennelly out there today, up at FMC. They employ about 35 people here on the Central Coast, and they're going to 50, and they're training more, and they produce fertilisers and herbicides and things like that right here on the Central Coast. And they're the sort of companies that that are actually employing in manufacturing these days, and there's many more in the defence industry and the space industry, defence industry, particularly when you get up into the hunter. And so we've put a $1.5 billion program into investing in these businesses. And what we're also doing to support them is ensuring that we're getting their gas prices down. I mean, gas prices that we're paying here in Australia right now, and this is critical for manufacturing, and this is an important part of our manufacturing strategy. Gas prices now in Australia, or I should say overseas, what they're paying overseas are 4 times what they are here in Australia. And the reason for that is the gas mechanism we put in place, which secured gas supplies for the domestic market here in Australia. Now, that's also getting electricity prices down. Electricity prices have fallen 8% in the last 2 years. So for manufacturing to be successful, they've got to be paying lower taxes, which they are through the instant asset write-off, which means you can basically buy a $250,000, $400,000 piece of plant in your manufacturing business, write it off in just 1 year. So that's in place right now. You've got to get your energy prices down, which we've done on both gas and electricity. And then you've got to have the innovation and the research and the market access, which means they can get to scale. And we're also investing in all of that. So we agree. We make things here in Australia and we're really good at it. And we're going to make a lot more things under my government here in Australia.
Good on you, Daniel. Thank you very much. Prime Minister, we'll take a quick break as we are live across the country on the Central Coast. More with Paul Murray live in a sec. Welcome back to the Central Coast. We're here with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. How good, by the way, is Australia, where people can hang out with their Prime Minister, a few beers, a bit of rum and coke happening in the middle of the room?
I remember when we did that up in Townsville a few years ago, Paul.
Yes.
And we were partaking at the same time, from memory.
Correct.
Not tonight.
Yes, yes. We're only slightly pink in this room because it's rather warm. In that one, it wasn't for that reason. All right. Now, I want to ask you something before we get into a whole bunch of other questions. You know that politics can be incredibly personal and sometimes over the line. How do you handle when it gets too personal and it feels like just waves and waves of really personal gear?
Well, I think one of the most important things for anyone who is in public life is you've got to have a thick skin. And that doesn't mean there are things that happen that obviously don't impact. Of course they do, but it goes with the territory. But families off limits, that's one thing. And our families often feel it far more than we do as those in public life. But, you know, you choose to go into this because you believe in what you're doing. And so you steel yourself for that and you just get on with the job. That's what I've always done. And because what you're about is very important. And you know what? If you don't know who you are, well, frankly, you don't have the internal strength to be able to face up to the many things you do in politics. Now, in the last 3.5 years, there's one thing that people have said to me over particularly the last couple of years, whether they agree with me or not, they have said, gosh, you guys have had to face a lot in the last 3.5 years, from floods to fires to mouse plagues to the pandemic, the drought, and of course the ever-present threats in our own region in the Indo-Pacific, and now we have war in Europe and Russia invading Ukraine. This has been quite a remarkable period in Australia's history, and I can tell you it's not for the faint-hearted or the inexperienced.
Now, also, elections, regardless of who it is, any opposition leader has got, frankly, an easier run because they can promise the world. They don't have to have form, but also they don't have to explain the particulars of the grey that exists, right? It's always easier to go hardcore, black and white. So again, as a person who's got to run on a vision for the next 3 years, but also explaining in part the past 3 years, how do you do that? What's your plan for that in the next few months where you're going to meet as many people as possible? I get it. But how are you going to be able to deliver, frankly, as clean a message as an opposition who can just say, promise everything and fingers crossed?
Well, you've got to just stay true to your plan. And that's why I say I'm not pretending to be anyone else. You can't all of a sudden turn up an election and say, oh, I'm not that person I was for 20 years or 30 years, and all of a sudden to pretend you're everybody from John Howard to Bob Hawke to Kevin Rudd to whoever. I'm sorry, Mark, he didn't claim you. He's happy about that. Mark's very happy about that. But, you've got to be sure about who you are in politics and to deal with the challenges that come your way. And I look forward to have the opportunities. I mean, the pandemic was very limiting. I spent a long time in isolation and quarantine. And as you know, Paul, I love to be out there. And that's where I prefer to be. But the other thing is I have a great faith in the Australian people. And I have a great faith in their judgment. And I have a great faith in them knowing the consequences of the decisions that they make. And in between elections, there's all sorts of sentiment, lots of opinions are expressed. But when you go in that ballot booth, then how you vote makes a difference. And it has impacts and it has consequences. It's going to determine the economy you're going to live in for the next decade. It's going to determine our ability to engage the national security issues and keep Australians safe. It determines who's going to stand up to the big tech companies or the big energy companies, which we've done, frankly. We've stood up to all of them. We've stood up to all of them. And we'll continue to do that because where I gain my strength from, and I refer to them as the quiet Australians at the last election, and that continues to be my view. Those Australians, they haven't been making a lot of noise over the last few years. They've just been dealing with the 3.5 years I've just mentioned. They've been dealing with all those natural disasters. They've been dealing with the pandemic. They've been dealing with homeschooling. They've been dealing with isolation. And they've done it. And they've gritted through. And Australia has now come through this pandemic, and hopefully that means we're not having further variants that could cause massive disruption. But even if that were to occur, then I know Australians would continue to push through again. And those Australians know what's important: their jobs, their security, their family, their way of life. And I think they should get to decide those things, not governments.
I'm with you. Graham is our next questioner. Come up to the microphone, Graham, and have a chat to the Prime Minister. We're live from the Central Coast. We'll be doing these all over the country. Graham, Prime Minister.
Hello, Prime Minister, and welcome to the Central Coast. It's great to see you here. Thank you. And also, Paul, thanks for bringing Paul Murray live to Gosford. Fantastic, mate.
Happy to help.
So my question is also about electricity supply and how much we need. So in Australia, with more than 20 million cars registered, and with the transition to electric cars, as many car manufacturers will only be producing 100% electric cars in the next few years. Has the government considered the massive increase in demand for electricity to charge these cars, replacing the enormous amount of energy currently supplied by petrol and diesel? And it's reasonable to expect most cars will be plugged into the grid in the evening and when the domestic demand is already peak and the sun is going down and the breeze has dropped out for the night. Considering coal-fired baseload power stations are being closed around the country as electric car sales are expected to dramatically increase, how will the huge increase in demand for electricity be addressed?
Well, the first point on Graham, I'm being here on the Central Coast. I'm really pleased to be doing that. Came up on the North Connects this morning, which is great, and to see that in place now. And we're out there with Lucy today, opening the new Newcastle University Clinical School and Medical Research Institute, and some $75 million. And we're going to see local doctors and specialist surgeons. The reality of that is going to happen here in the Central Coast, and you can see it there now. I did the groundbreaking 5 years ago, and that is now a reality here on the Central Coast, and there are many other projects. When we came here tonight, Lucy, I noticed across the road is the Commonwealth Public Service building that was built here and has brought hundreds and hundreds of extra jobs in here in the Gosford CBD, which is transforming. But to come to your point on electric vehicles, Graham, I have a different view about how quickly that's going to change going forward, because under our policies, I'm not forcing anybody to drive anything. If you want to drive one and buy one, good for you. That's great. I think that's your choice. If you don't want to drive one, that's fine. Keep driving the car you've got. Buy one that's like it, if that's what you want to do. Because our policy when it comes to emissions reduction is about choice, not mandates. It's not about taxes, it's about technology. And the technology will move at the pace of the consumers and what they want. And the consumers who want that will pay for it. And I'm not about to be subsidising those costs. I mean, if you buy an electric vehicle, you don't pay fuel excise for a start. So there is already an inbuilt advantage of going down that path if that's what you want to do. But my opponent, the Labor Party, Anthony Albanese, said that he is going to encourage electric vehicles by abolishing the import tariffs on them. There aren't any import tariffs on electric vehicles. That's what comes when you haven't done a budget before and you've never had a financial portfolio. They're the sort of things you don't know. It helps. But when it comes to the electricity grid system itself and the baseload power, well, it's similar to the answer I gave before. You've got to keep your coal-fired power stations running as long as you possibly can. You need to have gas in the system to back that up, because we will see coal-fired power stations reach the end of their natural life. That will happen. That will happen.
My point is that inevitably we'll be driving electric cars, whether it's in 3 years' time or 5 years' time or 10 years' time.
I think it's more the latter end of that, to be honest.
It may still be, but we'll need to have the power to charge these things.
Yeah, and that's why we've invested $21 billion ensuring that not only we're getting the baseload power that continues to come through things like gas and these types of resources, and take what we've been able to do already in ensuring we get replacement for some of the stations that have gone out. And we all remembered what happened when Hazelwood went out. I'm concerned about now Eraring is going out, and we want to see replacement for that reliable, affordable capacity here in the Central Coast. Now, we backed that up last time by going ahead and ensuring we build a gas-fired power station at Kurri Kurri, which the Labor Party was against, then they were for, and then they decided to change it so it would cost twice as much to build. That's not a good policy. What we've done is we went, OK, that needs to happen. We told the energy companies, if you don't build it, we will. Because we're not mugs. We know that energy companies make more money by there being less power, right? Yeah. So we made sure there was more power. And so we weren't going to allow an investment decision which said, well, we won't build it and therefore we'll just take the higher prices that come with that. Angus Taylor did a great job on this. We said, work with Snowy Hydro, they're building it. That will be breaking ground very, very soon. So we problem solve to deal with those issues, but our preference is for the private energy companies to go and ensure that they're replacing coal-fired power plants which reach the end of their economic life with reliable, affordable power to address the very needs that you've talked about. Energy consumption, though, how much energy people use, has remained pretty constant for some time now and, in fact, has dipped. And so getting the investment in that is obviously a challenge, but that's why we've been stepping up in the way we have. Good stuff.
Sylvia, step on down. We've got a question here. As Sylvia's coming to the microphone, you famously, of course, talked about puzzles and puzzles during lockdown. Recently, you had a week at home. Was there anything in particular that is your secret lockdown skill that you've discovered, that you've taught yourself?
Well, I wish there had been time for puzzles. My lockdown, I can tell you, was pretty busy in between responding to the floods, of course, which have been devastating. But in addition to that, we had the situation in the Ukraine. We're also pulling a budget together at the moment. So it was, I've got to tell you, it was a very busy isolation, but was pleased to get back out of isolation and get on the road. And of course, the first thing I did was to go up to the Northern Rivers. But yeah.
Fair enough. Good question. Sylvia, let's go.
Hi. I'd like to know if we could have more federal funding for trade schools in high schools, because there's more than one pathway to succeed from school and not just going to university. So many children are told that to get a good job, you need to go to uni. Go to uni, get a good job. There are a lot of children that won't go there. We need the people from the uni, doctors, lawyers. We need the people, electricians, builders, hairdressers from the TAFE. But we also need the children that won't do either. And they're the children that sometimes fall through the cracks. They need to know that if they're going to be the cleaner that cleans your office of a night, the postie, train bus drivers, and the baristas, need the baristas. but they also need to feel self-worth. Yeah. So if we could teach from a young age, from basics, all jobs are necessary. That creates the circle. We all need them. We wouldn't survive without them. But they need that self-worth.
Yeah, true.
To survive.
Good on you, Sylvia. Thank you.
Well, look, thanks, Sylvia. best form of welfare is a job. We all know that. It's a truism. One of the things I'm most pleased about as we've come through this pandemic is we currently have 220,000 Australians in trade training right now. Now, just to give you an idea of the significance of that number, that is the highest number that we've ever had of Australians in trade training at any time since economic records began, which was in 1963. So we've got more kids in trade training, funded through the massive investment we put, and we did it through the National Cabinet, I can tell you. We put down half the money, they put down the other half of the money. It was $1 billion through the Job Trainer program. And prior to that, we also put in the Boosting Apprenticeships program and the New Apprenticeships program. Now, the reason we did that at the start of the pandemic was as we looked into that abyss, and we did this before we even did JobKeeper, Josh and I were very concerned that we were going to lose a generation of skills. Last one on, first one off. And for small businesses that were going to be doing it tough anyway, the idea of taking apprentices through the next couple of years was going to be beyond them. So we made a deal with the employers of apprentices right across the country, and we kept them all. They didn't leave because I knew if they left their apprenticeship in the middle of this pandemic, so many of them would never have come back. And I agree with you. Whether you go to TAFE, whether you go to get training as an apprentice, whether you go to university, whatever you happen to do, whether you go and start your own business and do neither of those, any of those things. These are the choices we have as Australians. But I agree 100% that we have spent more on trades training in this country and we've been getting the results. But equally, by investing in that trades training, we are providing the base for our economy to grow, particularly in manufacturing, but in the many other skills that, you've mentioned. Hairdressing was one. I got some tutoring on how to do that the other day down in Melbourne. A few people had a bit of a crack at me. Anyway, whatever. I wasn't that good at it. I haven't got much to work with. A bit more than Chris Kenny, though. So trade training, incredibly important. And we're going to continue to invest. And we've been trying to reform that with the states and to have some further agreements to keep that funding going in the future. And I'm confident we will. I know it'll happen here in New South Wales. And there's been great work done with the South Australian government. I mean, Stephen Marshall's done a tremendous job with apprentices and training down in South Australia. And I think he's done a terrific job in keeping their economy firing up.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. Take another break, Prime Minister. And more questions from the Central Coast in a second here on Paul Murray Live. Also, Mark Latham will be here with Chris Kenny and Joe Hildebrand. More in a sec. We're back here on the Central Coast with Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Thank you so much for doing this, mate. I really appreciate it. We've got plenty of people who've got a question for us. Step on up. What's your name and what's your question for the Prime Minister?
Hello, I'm David.
Hey, David.
Hi. Love your work, PM. Yours too, Scott.
Thank you. He loves your work, PM. Yours too, Scott. Thank you. You just made the promo.
We just... At the top of the show, I used Paul's words. He said, we've had a crappy few years, and I think we could all probably agree that's true. Despite that crappy 3 years of COVID, we have seen Australia do incredibly well. Our statistics around vaccination, infection and mortality have been incredible. And at the same time, we've also managed an incredibly strong economy. So how is it that the Liberals aren't an absolute shoo-in to win the next election?
Well, all sorts of people make predictions about elections. I remember that occurring about this time 3 years ago. Remember that very, very vividly. And look, my honest answer about as you go into an election, we have been through quite an extraordinary last 3.5 years. You know, people have suffered a lot and they're suffering right now as we speak. And as you go through times like that, understandably, people will get very frustrated and they'll get very hurt and they will express that. And I understand that. But as you get closer to the election, this isn't a referendum. This is a choice. This election is a choice between who you want to lead the country. Anthony Albanese, Labor Party, undoubtedly supported by the Greens, or the Liberals and the Nationals, and myself as Prime Minister. And I believe Australians, particularly those who've been quietly going about their lives over the last 3 years and during all the things we've talked about, they are starting to focus up on that choice. And we'll move from a sentiment being expressed to people making real choices about where they want the country to go over the next 3, 5 and 10 years. And make no mistake, this isn't like responding to a phone call, who do you think you're going to support in an election? That doesn't change anything. But when you go into that ballot booth and you put Neil McGill down there in Shortland, the Liberal candidate, then you can ensure that you can keep Australia's economy strong and you can keep Australians safe. And that's what's up for grabs. That's what makes the difference. And so as the election gets closer, I think this will come more into sharp focus. And I trust Australians. I always have, that they will weigh this up. I mean, in Australia, we don't have the sort of politics like they have in many other countries. I mean, in between elections, Australians basically just get on with their lives. And frankly, probably the less they'd like to see of politicians, the better in between. And I get that. And I actually like that about Australia. They're constantly not agonising and talking their country down. Yeah, there's plenty who do that, but they're on other programs. Yeah. And Australians, though, when it comes to the big choices, I think will focus on these things. And at the moment, and it is always the case, because federal elections are always close. They're always close. And it'll come down to who do you think's best able and experienced to manage the economy. And in a world where, frankly, the world has just gone to war in Europe again, and the pressures we face in the Indo-Pacific, who is best prepared, most seasoned, most experienced to actually take us through that challenging time? That's the choice. It's a clear one.
Thank you, mate. We've got Gavin, I think, who's got another question for you here, PM. Gavin, meet the Prime Minister.
Mr Prime Minister, thank you so much for being here today. And the one thing I have thought about since sitting here asking my question is how lucky we are. 25 million Australians, we confront the PM face-to-face, 40 million Ukrainians cannot.
That's right.
Mr Prime Minister, I think one of the, perhaps looking at supply chains, slightly different subject, someone who's inherently interested in it. During COVID, one of the outcomes of COVID is that perhaps we realised that Western countries realised that we were very heavily reliant on one country to produce our goods for us. And I think, now moving forward, there's a question to be asked perhaps of, we're still reliant on many of our products and services, particularly our products, our low-cost products, coming from one particular country. So they're coming from China. As our relationship with China continues to develop, it's been a tough one, clearly. Every Australian can see that. How do we ensure that Australians don't lose access to the cheap and affordable products that we rely on from that country? And also equally, can the government do anything to assist business diversify perhaps? Because ultimately, whether it's the government who controls it, whether or not perhaps it's the consumers who end up controlling it, what do you think?
I think it's a combination of both. But what we're seeing in the global economy now is a big shift taking place. And many of the things that China have been producing for the last 10 or 20 years, they're now being produced in Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia. And what we've done as a government is to build the relationships with all of those other countries as well, including India. And there are a lot more options. And what we want to see take place is Australians, companies continue to diversify, not to put all their eggs in one basket. I mean, most of the growth in our trade with China, particularly outside the resources sector, only took place in about the last 6 to 7 years. It wasn't always thus. It really surged over the most of last decade. And that was welcome. But at the same time, we have to be careful about a dependence that is created, and this is exactly the point you're making. And it's not just us who've worked this out. This is exactly the same conversation I was having with the Dutch Prime Minister this morning, Mark Rutte. And they're confronting that by becoming too reliant on the Russians for oil and gas and wheat and a range of other things. And here they find themselves in a bind. Now, my message to Europe and my message to Australians is we cannot allow ourselves to become dependent like that. We've faced a lot of coercion from China. Our barley's been targeted, our wine's been targeted, many industries, our crayfish and other things like this. But we've held our ground and we've stood up to it. And that barley has found other markets. And while the wine isn't getting the same price in other places and it's harder, they are going to see this through. And I've been so proud, particularly of Australia's primary producers, who would rather their sovereignty as a country than the coin that comes with becoming over-reliant on one partner who's told you they don't want you involved again anyway. So I think Australian industry and primary producers have shown tremendous courage, but they've also been smart too. And we support them through things like export market development grants and things like that, our trade offices around the world, whether it's in South America or India or other places. Right now, the Trade Minister is working to finalise another one of these export agreements. We put the export agreement in place for the UK, first country to do so. And the other one, which I mentioned to you, is we formed a partnership with what's called the ASEAN countries. Now it's countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on, Brunei. We were the first country in the world to develop such an agreement with that group of countries. We beat China by about a day or so. And we've always understood that Southeast Asia, when you put all of those economies together, that's a massive partnership for us. One of the first things I had the great privilege to do was finalise the agreement with the Indonesian government, the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement. And that is in place now. And that's dealing with everything from students through to heavy industry and resources. So how you deal with the rest of the world now is really important. It's why you need to make about as much as you can profitably and successfully in your own country, and we're doing that. We're manufacturing mRNA vaccines here in Australia. We've put that agreement in place, and many other things. Critical minerals processing, which I'm sure you know a bit about. Critical minerals are the things that end up in your iPhones and all the technology. Now, China has a stranglehold on that global market, and we've been working with the United States, Japan, Germany, India, and a range of other countries to ensure that Australia's critical industries can provide an alternative to those countries.
Countries like, India, who shares our
Yes.
value of democracy.
Absolutely.
To deal with someone like India rather than perhaps other options, right?
Supply chains now just aren't about cost and efficiency, they're about trust. And for Australian businesses, you've got to think about the price, the risk of what supply chains you're in and dependent upon. That's just smart business practice. And what we're doing as a government is to provide more opportunities for them to diversify their risk. But if you put all your eggs in one basket, well, it's the same in any business strategy. That's not going to land you in necessarily the best place.
Good stuff. We've got two quick ones before we're done here. We've got Greg, and then I think it's James, our last one. But Greg, jump up, mate. Jump in. What do you want to say?
Good evening, Mr Prime Minister. Thanks for coming. My question is, I just see a pattern in the last 15 years of election cycle politics rather than long-term goals that this country should achieve. That's sort of local, state and federal levels. It just keeps going on. And I just hoping, well, what you could think, maybe trying to put more long-term goals in for this country. I've got two daughters like yourself, and I want them to grow up the way I did, which was in a prosperous and profitable country.
Well, look, thanks for your question. I'd encourage you by saying it happens a lot more than you think. As I said, I drove up here on the North Connects. That was a long-term project. We're building Western Sydney International Airport. That is a project which still has many years to run, and we started that 7 years ago. These are long-term progress. The Inland Rail project, making sure that we can be making steel in Whyalla, which is actually making the steel for our naval shipbuilding and the Inland Rail. The dam projects that we've talked about. All of these projects, Snowy Hydro 2.0, another massive engineering project of gigantic scale. These things goes over long periods of time. The rebuilding of our defence forces to get it from 1.57% up to 2.1%. It's taken us 8 years to get there.
Really good to hear that announcement the other day.
Well, and we're going to another 18,500 in our defence forces, which you can't do overnight, but we'll be adding to them every single year. The AUKUS agreement, which is a forever agreement, the Defence Reciprocal Access Agreement with the Japanese government. These things set us up for 20 years and beyond. And so as a government, we've looked out because we know that we need to secure Australia in our part of the world. And yes, you have to invest in your defence forces to do that. You have to invest in your security agencies, your intelligence agencies, your border protection agencies, all of which were cut under Labor. You've all got to strengthen your economy so you can pay for it. But you've got to develop these relationships with all these countries I've been talking about. And when you do that with like-minded countries, we work closely with Indonesia, with India, the Quad, you might have heard of that, a partnership with Japan, India, Australia and the United States. I met with them just the other night. And on top of that, the agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, the AUKUS arrangement, you may have heard of that. It's not just about submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, it's about a lot more than that. But that project goes over the next 15 years or so, and that's setting us up for the 50 after that. So there's a lot of it that goes on. And under our government, it'll continue to go on.
Good stuff. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And our final question tonight is from Jane. We'll try and make it short on both counts, but Jane, your question.
Mine's a personal question, Prime Minister. I believe...
No, I won't play the ukulele, I promise. Look how disappointed everybody is.
You should tell people why you play it, because you're only teaching your daughter to play guitar.
I was teaching Lily how to play guitar. But anyway.
Your personal question.
So I believe we share an uncommon faith. And I'm interested to know how much your beliefs and faith flow into your professional life, knowing that the tenets of our faith are to be led into all truth, and how that happens for you and therefore impacts on us. A professor of biology from Monash once said, nothing matters unless it matters in the ultimate, and nothing matters in the ultimate unless it's eternal. And that's a word you've used a couple of times tonight. So I understand that you're leaving a legacy. Could you explain more about that?
Yeah, look, I've been public about my faith over a long period of time. That's just to be transparent. It's not a reason to vote for me or not vote for me. It's got nothing to do with politics. My faith isn't my politics. My faith doesn't sort of set out a policy manual either. My faith informs who I am. It's a part of who I am. It's part of who Jenny is. It's part of our family and how we raise our family. My faith informs the why, not necessarily the what. Why do we do the things? Why do we want to see young people in jobs and not spend a life wasted on not having to depend on welfare for their entire existence? Why do we do the things we do right across the government, from the National Disability Insurance Scheme to making sure that we're helping women who are the subject of domestic violence? We do these things because we care. And where does that care come from? Well, it comes from who we are as individuals. And for many people, that's an expression of their religious faith. Others, it's an expression of other things. But that's what it means to me. It helps guide, encourage and strengthen me, as I know it does millions of Australians. And that's why I've always been keen to ensure that Australians are never victimised or discriminated against because of their faith and what they believe in, because it's an important part of who they are. And it's impossible to separate what they believe from who they are. I don't have a professional life and a faith life and a family life. I have a life, and all of these things are combined together. They define who I am. And that's why I'm not confused about who I am. I'm pretty certain about it and pretty clear-eyed about the way ahead. And that gives me the strength to do the job that I think Australians need doing.
Good stuff. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you very much. And thank you, Central Coast. The Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. Let's keep doing it around the country, mate. More on Paul Murray Live in a sec. Thank you very much for watching. Welcome back to the Central Coast. You enjoy that? Good. Joining us now to talk about that and a whole lot more, the New South Wales One Nation leader, the great Mark Latham. Give it up for him. Future Senator Chris Kenny. It's up to him if he wants to run. And Captain Planet Joe Hildebrand. All right. Chris, I'll start with you. What do you think about what was asked, how he responded, and whether that's the same guy who won in 19?
Love the questions. Love the questions. That's the point about talking to, as you say, normal Australians, real Australians. Totally different questions to what we get from the Canberra press gallery, who are just looking to push him into the. So, and I thought the Prime Minister was on his game. He's on his front foot. He's talking a good book. He's got a lot of good arguments to make. And I thought, see, one of the difficult things for the coalition is the economy, right? We know they're stronger on the economy, but they've spent so much money. They've sort of made it a bit wishy-washy between the coalition and Labor. You can't really scare people about all that Labor spending and debt because they've had to spend so much and create so much debt for to get through the pandemic. Well, I thought he dealt with that really well. This idea that Labor always knows how to start spending, they can't stop. The other quick point I'd make is how good is John Howard? Because this line you're hearing from Scott Morrison now, it's very effective. That is, you've got an opposition leader who doesn't know who he is. That came from John Howard last week, like a laser. He was onto it.
Joe, what did you think about what you saw? And did you see, okay, this is the guy who can do pretty well in 5 weeks, or did you see something else?
I think I've always thought he's a supreme campaigner. I'm not sure if it'll be enough to get him over the line. I thought he's obviously very much in his element. Is he still here, by the way? Can he hear me?
Yeah, probably.
I thought he was clearly very much in his element, but obviously there's a lot of love in the room for him. Whether or not there are swinging voters out there in their lounge rooms thinking, actually, he's changed my mind. I thought he was very strong on economy. I thought he was really strong on the big picture stuff. So this is what I stand for. I stand for, private businesses, private citizens getting up and doing things for themselves. I thought the faith question was really interesting because he could have very easily walked into a trap and there would have been professional media monitors waiting for him to say that faith guides his decision, and then people would have been screaming on the ABC tomorrow morning saying, oh my God, it's a fundamentalist Christian.
They will anyway that he did this program.
He's doing gay conversion therapy to everybody en masse through the TV. So I think he was weak on the electricity stuff, to be honest. And the question about coal, there's not going to be a coal-fired electricity generator in Australia ever again. And that is the truth of it. But again, and I've been looking at heaps of climate polling and climate data, and it's a really tough one for him because you've got voters in, say, Capricornia in regional Queensland whose livelihoods depend on this sort of stuff. And you've got voters, in Kooyong, and you've got voters in Wentworth and Goldstein who are lining up, the so-called doctors' wives, the people, affluent people who can afford to worry about climate change, lining up to kick him. So he's got to kind of navigate this road in between. And same thing Labor tried to do in 2019, and we all know how that ended up. So,
Mark, what do you think? What did you like or what you didn't like?
Well, I suppose the news poll today says that he's kaput. And if the news poll is correct, there's no way he can make up a 10-point gap in 2 months. And the election is shaping up a lot more like 1996 and 2007 than 2019. You don't get many back-to-back miracles in politics. In fact, it's pretty rare you get one at all. So, that's the political reality. The feedback I get from voters is that compared to what they thought they were voting for 3 years ago, he hasn't shown enough conviction. He's given too much ground away to the woke. A lot of questions and a lot of answers about electricity, but no mention of his flagship policy of net zero. Carbon emissions, which is a massive killer of coal mining. It's a massive killer of manufacturing. It's a killer of affordable, reliable electricity. Now, I'll give you one guarantee. If that gas peaking plant at Curry keeps Tomago alive in an environment where Matt Keane, the Green Liberal, is running electricity policy in New South Wales, then I'm Santa Claus. It ain't going to happen. So I think there's a fair element of delusion there. And another telling comment, and, I'm really filthy about the Prime Minister on this front, as I know Chris would be. There was a mention there of TV programs that run down Australia, not this one. Well, it's the ABC. Why give them an extra $1 billion in funding? Those scumbags who hate Australia, who are so fundamentally biased, why didn't, after the shameful campaign against him 3 years ago, why didn't he stand up and say, I am gutting you people for what you are, returning you to what you should be, a regional rural radio service, no more. Laura Tingle and all the mad, crazy bias from the left, straight out the door, you can go down to Centrelink. Why didn't he say that?
Yeah. I mean, also, what I could feel watching was people were, as soon as sort of conversation about electricity started or supplementing of electric vehicles and all of this, everyone, I would suggest, many people in this room remember the fervence with which they fought in 2019, and some people you can see are searching for, look, I want to fight, I'm ready to go to fight, but give me the thing that we're fighting about. Now, I think that it's about each way elbow. I think it's about the choices that are in front. But of what you saw tonight, did you start to see the contours of what this room is supposed to take back to a discussion over the barbecue about, I was with the PM the other day and he said boom, boom, boom?
Yeah, well, the big point is away from the big picture. The big picture is one thing. I suppose national security is a key. But as Mark mentioned, the net zero, electricity, renewables things, that's become blancmange between the two major parties. It was a key winner for Morrison at the last election, but he's gone down that path. He satisfied the Q&A crowd, the ABC crowd, but it takes away one of his key campaign points of difference. And the other one, I think, is the economy. Even though it's still pretty strong, it's not as clear-cut as it was pre-pandemic. So what you saw tonight is he's going very much to the other guy. I think that's the right thing to do. You've got to say, all right, then, are you going to really switch to this bloke now when the economy's uncertain, there's a global environment that's very uncertain? Is now the time to go to a bloke who doesn't know who he is? It's a tough argument for him to run because he started from so far behind. But I think a lot of the fundamentals line up in his favour. I don't think the country is focused on the election contest yet. I think it starts tonight maybe, or maybe in 2 weeks' time in the budget. When the people focus on it, the polls are going to come closer together, whether it's close enough for Scott Morrison, we don't
I
know.
think the line on Albanese is wrong politically. I've known Albanese for 35 years. I can tell you, if there's one person in Australian politics who knows who he is, it's Anthony Albanese. He knows exactly who he is. He supported every failed, numbskull, left-wing policy for 35 years. You know the old lady on the Titanic?
Yeah.
It's been 84 years. Well, Albert's been 35 years and counting. So
Which is exactly why he's invoking
and if he
Bob
hangs-
Hawke and John Howard.
Yeah,
and
I know. But Albanese's got a deliberate strategy of the small target.
Yep.
He acknowledges that if people saw who he really is, he'd end up with about 20 seats. He's unelectable. So he's gone the small target. So you've got to flush him out for who he really is. And that's all those failed left-wing economic policies, no turning back of the boats, let them all in, no border protection. I mean, that's what he fundamentally stands for, the rubbish and the woke nonsense he'd have in our schools. That's where you've got to attack him. To say he doesn't know who he is not right, and I don't see how it's going to get Scott Morrison off the hook.
Okay, now I've got to defend Albo. I think the thing with Albo is, he's a pragmatist. Yes, he was.
Pragmatist about winning the election.
It was a power broker for the left faction. But again, he was a power broker.
But when you make this argument, you make it sound like he doesn't believe in anything.
Yes, and that's great. what you want.
He was a power broker for the left faction who wanted to have open borders and...
Listen, Joe, that bullshit artist on 60 Minutes last night said Bob Hawke was a mentor of his.
Yeah.
No bigger lie's ever been told. He went to those Labor conferences in the 80s and 90s, making speech after speech and telling everyone Bob Hawke and Paul Keating are a complete sellout of proper Labor tradition. These blokes have betrayed the Labor movement and betrayed working people. He is a first-rate bullshit artist, and the fact that he's getting away with it is phenomenal.
How good's Latham? We love him. But Joe, there's one thing that
politics is not about what you did or said 30 years ago. Otherwise, we'd all be in trouble. He is to the right of the policies that Bill Shorten was putting forward. It was Bill Shorten who was sounding like the crazy woke socialist redistributor of wealth, and Albo has very deliberately positioned himself as someone who is pro-aspiration, pro-business. He's junked all the negative gearing tax increases. He's junked the franking credit.
Joe, he's selling you the Harbour Bridge, mate.
What
you're buying it. You're buying it.
This? I apologise to Chris Smith. I'm going to take a couple of minutes of his show here. But to this point where there is the reality of what Albanese has been for 30 years, there's the reality of what's being presented. And, 500,000 people saw the ad last night of making it look, where he literally says, here are all the things and we're the party of big ideas. Didn't say what any of them were. Today says cost of living, but doesn't say anything about what that actually means.
The big idea is to shut up and not say that.
But you're talking about a list of policies, Joe, that Albo used to support and now he says he doesn't. They're officially on the policy list, they're gone. But they're what he believed in and they're what he argued for in the past. And that's why tonight was important, because the Prime Minister did segue to that attack a bit. Now, it might be too late, we don't know. But you're not going to win. Scott Morrison is not going to win unless he draws people's attention to Albanese, what Albanese stands for, what Labor would really do. And as you say, they're trying to sneak in with a small target. Somehow Scott Morrison's got to direct the media attack to embarrass the media into asking some tough questions and exposing this stuff, because at the moment it looks like he'll skate on through.
Again, I apologise to my team back at home and I apologise to Chris Smith. But Mark, there is one thing I very quickly want to do for 60 seconds here. There are people in this room that have lost their job because of vaccine mandates. We live in a scenario, as we've talked about before on the show, where A teacher can't go to work, but an unvaccinated parent can go to teacher-parent night. We're past the point when, if that ever mattered, it mattered. Do you think that it's too dangerous for the Prime Minister to start to speak against this stuff because all the Twitter stuff starts screaming at him, or there is an untapped group of people who go, you know what, this is over?
Well, I think there's a general rule in politics. If Twitter says you're wrong, you're most definitely right.
Absolutely.
And you need to proceed accordingly. And on that, we've got a massive teacher crisis in New South Wales. There are whole schools that have closed early and don't maintain a full teaching day anymore because of the lack of staff. And they've sacked at least 7,000 teachers under these mandates, sacked them or stood them down. They're not at work. They're not giving out the full accurate data, and I'll be coming to that in the New South Wales Parliament. But it's not just the teachers who should be working and instructing our children, particularly when, as you say, the parents can go to the schools unvaccinated. It's the police have been sacked just today in New South Wales, the fireys, the AMBOs, the SES volunteers who couldn't go and help out in the floods because of their health choices. There's the nurses. I mean, there's a whole cohort of people who feel like it's time to lift these mandates and get them back into jobs. And that would be one of the best employment policies we could have for the country. Yeah.
South Australia got rid of the mandate on police last week.
Oh, there we
The
go.
South Australian government got rid of the mandate for police. Police are back to work. It should be the same for everyone.
All right. Lads, thank you very much. Central Coast, we love you. We'll see you again through the election. That's our show for tonight. Chris Smith is next on Sky News.